Greetings to all our viewers tuning into our channel. There are moments in a nation's history that aren't marked by explosions or breaking news alerts, but by a quiet shift that seeps into the collective mindset. It's the moment people begin to realize that while the world around them still speaks of peace, cooperation, and stability, the familiar assumptions they once relied on no longer hold up. The old rules haven't fully collapsed, but cracks have appeared deep enough that those paying close attention can no longer ignore them. Canada is entering one of those moments. For much of the 20th century and the early 21st, Canada existed in a strategic space that was rarely questioned. Its geography right next to the United States, its strong alliance, free trade agreements, and a rules-based international system all created a near-default sense of safety. For generations of Canadians, national security was an abstract concept, something found in defense white papers rather than daily political life. The world might be unstable elsewhere, but North America, and especially Canada, seemed to stand apart from those tremors. It is that very familiarity that becomes most dangerous when it begins to waver. The change hasn't come through war, but through unpredictability. Not through alliances suddenly falling apart, but through the creeping feeling that they could be bargained away at any moment. In this context, Canada is being forced to re-examine foundations it once took for granted. Is stability still a lasting condition, or just a temporary state, dependent on the will of greater centers of power? The return of Donald Trump to the global political stage has pushed that question to the forefront, not just because of the man himself, but because of the way he defines power and national interest. When the international order is no longer seen as a web of long-term commitments, but as a series of deals that can be constantly renegotiated, it's the countries that once relied on that stability who will feel the first shock most acutely. Canada cannot change its geography. It cannot sever its economic and security ties with the United States. And it cannot pretend that what happens in Washington is merely another country's domestic affair. Every shift in how the US wields its power sends ripples straight to Ottawa, whether Canada wants conflict or not. And it is from this sense of fragility that long-dormant concepts begin to reemerge. Sovereignty, self-defense capability, and national responsibility. Not as a call to arms, but as a fundamental question about how to exist independently in a world increasingly driven by pressure and conditions. To understand why this question has become so urgent, we must look directly at the worldview that is reshaping today's global order. A worldview where stability is no longer a given, but something to be bargained for. And in that world, Donald Trump has become the clearest symbol of the shift. To understand why Canada is being forced to rethink its views on security and stability, we need to start with a deeper shift in how power operates on the global stage. This isn't about one individual or controversial media statements. It's about the evolution of an entire logic of action. A logic that no longer sees the world as a system upheld by rules and long-term trust, but as a continuous series of transactions where every relationship can be reassessed at any moment. Within this logic, stability is no longer an end in itself. It becomes a conditional reward. Agreements no longer carry the weight of long-term commitment, but resemble short-term contracts, lasting only as long as they deliver clear and immediate benefits. Allies are no longer strategic partners who share responsibility, but entities that must constantly prove their worth in a cold calculation of interests. This perspective was clearly visible during past trade negotiations. Agreements once seen as pillars of regional economic stability suddenly appeared fragile, not because they failed technically, but because they were viewed through a win-lose lens focused on short-term gains. Traditional diplomatic language gave way to public pressure. Uncertainty, rather than being something to avoid, became a tool used to force concessions from the other side. For Canada, this isn't an unfamiliar or abstract experience. Its economy is so tightly intertwined with the US market that any tremor south of the border sends shockwaves across it almost instantly. When agreements are threatened, it's not just trade numbers that suffer. Canada's sense of strategic security also begins to erode. Because if the very frameworks once considered foundational can be renegotiated at any time, then what can truly be counted on as lasting? But the deepest impact of this transactional worldview isn't in trade. It lies in how it redefines commitment. When a major power that leads the international order begins to treat commitments as flexible and retractable, the entire security system, based on shared trust, becomes more fragile. Countries don't need to become direct adversaries to feel the risk. Merely being within the sphere of influence of such decisions pulls them into a vortex of uncertainty. Canada is positioned squarely in that space, not because Ottawa seeks confrontation or tension, but because geography and history have placed Canada in a strategic zone inseparable from the United States. When Washington's use of power becomes unpredictable, Canada doesn't have much buffer space to reassure itself that things will automatically return to normal. What's more concerning is that this transactional logic is gradually extending from economics into security. When pressure is applied not only through tariffs or negotiations, but through displays of power and deterrence, the line between partner and target of pressure begins to blur. In such a world, nations accustomed to the quiet guarantees of the old order are the ones who must adapt the most. This is where Canada's once default sense of safety begins to fade. Not because there is a clear and present threat, but because no one can be certain anymore that boundaries won't be tested. When stability becomes a condition, dependence becomes a vulnerability. And once that vulnerability is exposed, it's no longer just an issue of economics or diplomacy. It becomes a matter of sovereignty and survival. From that moment on, Canada can no longer view tensions with the United States solely through the lens of trade or short-term disputes. A much larger question begins to take shape. If the logic of hard power continues its resurgence, if pressure extends beyond the negotiating table, what form will the risks facing Canada take? And when those risks are no longer just about import-export figures, but about a country's place within broader strategic calculations, the necessary preparations can no longer stop at economics. For a long time, Canada believed that no matter how intense its disagreements with the United States became, they could ultimately be confined to the realm of economics. Tariffs could rise and fall, negotiations might get tense but would eventually cool down. Supply chains could be disrupted, but would ultimately settle into a new balance. That was the logic of a world where competition mostly played out at the negotiating table, and where international rules and institutions still acted as pressure valves for conflict. But that world is slipping away faster than many had imagined. As strategic rivalry returns to the center of global politics, economics is no longer the only battlefield. It has become the outer layer of a much larger game, one where hard power, military deterrence, and geostrategic positioning begin to shape how nations perceive one another. In that context, tools once considered strictly economic begin to take on the tone of strategic pressure. For Canada, this shift carries particular weight. An economy tightly bound to the United States means that every shock from Washington isn't just about trade figures. When trade policy is used as a signal of power, it sends a clear message. Relationships are no longer guaranteed by habit or history. They must be continuously validated through benefit and compliance. What worries Ottawa isn't isolated tariffs. It's the possibility that this logic will continue to bleed into other areas. When a major power begins to treat pressure as a standard tool, the boundary between economic competition and security pressure becomes dangerously thin. In such a world, countries are no longer judged solely on their own behavior, but on their place within a broader strategic picture. Canada, whose geography is inseparable from North America, has no privilege of standing outside that view. In the eyes of America's strategic rivals, Canada is not merely an independent country with its own policies. It is part of a security space inherently linked to Washington. And in scenarios where tensions escalate, that space can become a calculated target, regardless of Ottawa's intentions. This is where the risks move beyond economics. They touch on the issue of strategic dependence. When a nation lacks sufficient self-defense capabilities, it must place its trust in the restraint of others. But in an environment where restraint is no longer a default principle, that dependence quickly turns into vulnerability. Security experts are increasingly emphasizing that in modern power competition, the most dangerous factor is not open aggression, but deliberate ambiguity. There's no need for direct conflict. simply creating the sense that boundaries might be tested, that pressure could intensify at any moment, is enough to alter the behavior of weaker nations. In that context, geography is no longer an absolute advantage. It can become a strategic burden. Canada is beginning to feel this reality as discussions around North American security shift from cooperation and collective defense toward questions of capability, contribution, and the ability to pull one's own weight. When questions like who protects whom arise more frequently, they carry an unspoken message. Guarantees are no longer unconditional. And when the risks extend beyond GDP figures or trade balances into the realm of being drawn into security scenarios beyond one's control, Canada is forced to see the world through a different lens. A lens where power is no longer something abstract or impolite to mention, but a key factor in determining both respect and vulnerability. Out of this shift, a more subtle layer of risk begins to emerge. It doesn't arrive in the form of warships or missiles, but through language, through the way power is expressed and normalized. When the language of pressure becomes familiar, when dominance-laced rhetoric is no longer seen as unacceptable, the question Canada must face is not just about material readiness, but about psychological readiness. Because in this new world, ignoring those signals could carry a far higher price than any ordinary trade dispute. For years, statements tinged with condescension or domineering undertones aimed at Canada were often met with awkward smiles. They were seen as exaggerations, as personal quirks, as attention-seeking remarks rather than serious policy signals requiring thoughtful analysis. For a stable, prosperous nation with a long-standing alliance with the United States, there seemed to be no real reason to feel threatened by mere words. But language has never been harmless. Language is where power thinking reveals itself before it turns into action. When words of dominance appear repeatedly, especially in an era when hard power is returning to the core of global politics, they are no longer something to laugh off. They become indicators of how a country views its relationships, who is seen as a partner, who as subordinate, and who might be pressured. For Canada, this shift is particularly sensitive. For decades, its bilateral relationship with the US was built on mutual respect and a sense of relative equality. Canada is not a great power, but it has never been openly treated as a country to have someone else's will imposed upon it. That sense created a kind of psychological safe zone, where disagreements were handled through institutions and dialogue, not through domineering rhetoric. As that safe zone begins to erode, the impact goes beyond policy. It touches on national psychology. A nation accustomed to being respected will acutely feel the moment when that respect is no longer a given, and that moment always arrives before any tangible change takes place. In this new language of power, sovereignty is no longer honored as a sacred boundary. It becomes a variable. A nation can still exist on a map, still have a government and a constitution, but its space for independent decision-making can be gradually narrowed through economic pressure, psychological tactics, and political influence. Dependency is cultivated, and when it runs deep enough, influence arises on its own, without the need for overt coercion. This is exactly why Canada can no longer afford to dismiss those linguistic signals. Not because the threat to sovereignty is immediate, but because history shows that major shifts rarely begin with tanks. They begin by blurring boundaries, by making things once considered unacceptable seem open to debate. When that mindset becomes normalized, actions follow, playing out in a context that has already been quietly prepared. The danger lies in this: a country unprepared psychologically will always respond slower than reality demands. When words are ignored for too long, by the time they morph into concrete policy or pressure, the window to adapt has already closed. And in a world of strategic competition, delay can often mean defeat. This is why Canada must ask itself an uncomfortable question. If the principles of respect and equality are no longer guaranteed by habit or history, what will uphold them? The answer cannot be trust alone. It cannot rely solely on goodwill. Because goodwill only has value when it rests on a foundation of capability. And it is at this point that Canada's shift in strategic thinking begins to take shape. Not as an emotional reaction to provocative words, but as a slow, deliberate awakening. When the language of power is used more openly, when a mindset of dominance is no longer masked behind traditional diplomacy, The most rational response is not outrage or denial. It is the reinforcement of one's own position. This is when Canada starts to move from asking, can we still rely on the old order, to a more pragmatic question, do we have the capacity not to rely on someone else's restraint? From that moment forward, goodwill alone is no longer enough to safeguard sovereignty. It must be backed by real strength, not to threaten others, but to ensure that Canada cannot be dismissed in anyone's power calculus. It is on this realization that a new approach begins to emerge in Canada's leadership thinking. An approach that doesn't abandon traditional values, but refuses to bind itself to the illusion that values alone can substitute for capability. And from here, the story is no longer about controversial remarks. It becomes a question of strategic choice, to move from blind trust to reliable self-defense, a choice grounded in the cold, pragmatic awakening of Mark Carney. The shift in Canada's strategic thinking hasn't come from panic or short-term political reflexes. It has emerged from a slow, almost painful realization. What once sufficed to ensure national safety for decades no longer meets the demands of a new reality. In this context, Mark Carney doesn't appear as a politician eager to project strength, but as someone who clearly sees the warning signs that have gone unheeded for too long. Mark Carney doesn't speak about national defense in the language of confrontation. He speaks in the language of risk. For Carney, the core issue isn't whether Canada wants to be tougher. It's whether Canada has the capacity to avoid being forced into a reactive posture in an increasingly harsh environment. This isn't about changing Canada's identity. It's about adapting so that identity can survive. For years, Canada has taken pride in its role as a moderate, multilateral country, placing trust in international law and the goodwill of its partners. But Carney understands that goodwill only functions within a stable power structure. When that structure begins to wobble, when commitments become flexible and conditional, goodwill alone, when isolated, turns from a strength into a vulnerability. The strategic awakening Carney represents is not a call to abandon traditional values. On the contrary, it's an effort to protect them with tools suited to the times. A country cannot demand respect if it cannot defend itself, and it cannot rely on others' restraint if it has no alternative but to accept risk. That's why defense investments and modernization efforts under Carney's vision don't carry a belligerent tone. They are technocratic, even dry. It's about auditing vulnerabilities left unaddressed for decades, gaps long covered by the assumption that the strategic environment would remain favorable. When those assumptions are no longer reliable, closing those gaps becomes a responsibility, not an option. Carney sees an uncomfortable truth with clarity. Canada doesn't need to become a military power to earn respect, but it also cannot remain a weak link in the North American security architecture. Fragility doesn't produce peace. It only makes external pressure easier to apply. In the logic of modern power, credible self-defense is the most persuasive language for preventing risk before it materializes. What matters is how Carney frames this conversation to the public. He doesn't speak of threats. He speaks of responsibility to sovereignty, responsibility to future generations, responsibility to ensure that Canada doesn't get pulled into scenarios where it has no voice. This is a subtle but fundamental shift from a mindset built on trust to one built on capacity. And once that mindset is accepted, the next question is no longer, should we prepare, but where and how should we prepare? Not all capabilities are equal. In a country with vast geography, harsh climate, and remote territories, presence and rapid response become the real metrics of sovereignty. This is where Carney's strategy begins to reach more concrete, tangible domains, spaces where old assumptions are being most visibly challenged, spaces where capability shortfalls are no longer theoretical risks, but real-world vulnerabilities. These include the Arctic, the long, inaccessible coastlines, the remote communities where protection cannot exist only on paper. From a strategic awakening, Canada moves into a phase of confronting reality. And in that reality, the question is no longer what kind of country Canada wants to be, but what gaps must be filled so that its sovereignty is not shaped by others. That question leads directly to the Arctic, to amphibious landing capabilities, and to the very specific measures of real-world strength. For a long time, the Arctic existed in the Canadian imagination as a distant, harsh, and largely symbolic space. It was the land of maps, of paper claims to sovereignty, of stories about ice and isolation. For decades, its remoteness and brutal climate fostered a kind of assumed safety. The region was too cold, too inaccessible to ever become a hotspot of global power competition. But that sense of safety is melting almost as fast as the permafrost. Climate change isn't just transforming the natural environment, it's upending strategic logic. Shipping routes once locked in ice are beginning to open. Resources once out of reach are now increasingly viable for extraction. And with that, the Arctic is shifting from a peripheral zone into a new arena of great power competition. In this space, presence is no longer symbolic, it's a direct measure of sovereignty. Canada is being forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Declarations of sovereignty aren't enough without the capacity to act on them. A country can claim authority on a map, but if it cannot reach, protect, or support its remote territories when needed, that sovereignty gradually loses strategic weight. Conflict isn't necessary. All it takes is for someone else to show up more consistently, more effectively, and the balance of reality begins to tilt. In this context, the concept of real capability becomes central. Not the capability to attack or intimidate, but the capability to be there in time, to be there flexibly, to be there convincingly, so that no one can treat Canada's absence as a given. And to make that possible, the old assumptions about defense are revealing their limits. Canada is a country with a vast coastline, complex terrain, and communities scattered across some of the most inaccessible regions on Earth. In moments of natural disaster, environmental crisis, or unexpected security threats, the ability to move forces quickly becomes a matter of survival. In this setting, amphibious capability is no longer a luxury or a relic of expeditionary warfare. It's a practical tool for territorial cohesion. Amphibious operations under this new lens aren't about bloody invasions. They're about spatial control. The ability to reach remote shores, to deliver humanitarian aid when infrastructure is cut off, to deploy quickly enough to establish a presence before a vacuum invites someone else to fill it. It's a quiet form of power, but one with immense deterrent value. Canada's past lack of these capabilities wasn't due to negligence. It was a product of a world that allowed such gaps to exist without immediate cost. But in the new strategic environment, empty space is no longer neutral. Empty space is seen by someone as opportunity. And when opportunity goes unchallenged, it begins to define the new normal. What Canada is trying to recover then isn't just equipment or military doctrine. It's trying to recover from a psychological gap decades in the making. The belief that security is something guaranteed from the outside, that geography alone will always shield against risk. As the Arctic becomes a contested zone, that mindset no longer holds. Real capability sends a clear message, even when no words are spoken. It says Canada is present, that Canada can respond, and that any strategic calculation involving North America must factor in the active presence of Ottawa, not just its quiet shadow behind Washington. In the world of power politics, credible presence is the most cost-effective way to prevent conflict. Ultimately, the Arctic is not just a story about ice or resources. It is a test of Canada's strategic maturity. A nation only truly owns its territory when it can care for it, protect it, and be there, even when it's difficult and expensive to do so. And it is precisely in the harshest landscapes that the question of sovereignty becomes most real. Does Canada have the capability to turn its rights into reality? When we connect all the emerging pieces, from the shifting international order, the return of hard power thinking, the increasingly assertive language, to the strategic awakening and the concrete adjustments in capability, one thing becomes clear. Canada is not facing a choice between peace and strength. Canada is facing a choice between illusion and maturity. For a long time, the world allowed many nations to believe that strength was something that could be avoided, that goodwill and international law were enough to protect sovereignty. But that world is receding, not because it was entirely wrong, but because it is no longer complete. When stability becomes conditional, when commitments become flexible, then preparation is no longer a sign of aggression. It is an act of self-respect. Canada is not preparing to challenge anyone. Canada is preparing so that it is never placed in a position where it must beg for someone else's restraint. That is a crucial distinction. A nation that is ready is not a nation looking for conflict. It is a nation that makes conflict unnecessary because the cost of pressuring it becomes too high, too complex, and too unrewarding. Strength in this view is not the roar of weapons. It is credible presence. It is the ability to respond when necessary. It is refusing to let strategic vacuums linger long enough to become normalized. That kind of strength doesn't change Canada's identity. It protects that identity from being defined by others. The dignity of a nation is not found in how loudly it speaks, but in whether it has the capacity to preserve its own choices, the choice to cooperate, the choice to exercise restraint, and if necessary, the choice to defend what matters most without bowing. That kind of dignity cannot be borrowed, and it cannot be bestowed. In an increasingly unpredictable world, where the lines between friends, partners, and sources of pressure are becoming blurred, readiness is the truest form of peace. Not peace based on hope, but peace grounded in responsibility. Responsibility to territory, responsibility to future generations, responsibility to the independent standing of the nation itself. Canada is crossing a critical threshold of awareness. And while the road ahead won't be easy, perhaps the most meaningful step is this. Canada has stopped comforting itself with old assumptions. Instead, it has chosen to look reality in the eye and to prepare for it with calm, discipline, and self-respect. If you have your own perspective on this shift, on the role of strength in protecting peace, leave your thoughts in the comments below. These kinds of conversations help us all better understand how the world is changing. And if you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue to explore the stories of geopolitics, strategy, and the moments that shape the destiny of nations.